Good afternoon, everybody. In the interests of not keeping you too long from your lunch, we're going to dive into what will be, hopefully, a very useful, but perhaps slightly more higher risk session than the ones you've seen so far. The reason for the higher risk is that my two colleagues here on stage have very kindly agreed to have a conversation rather than make presentations. And the reason we thought this was a good idea is that perhaps we are dealing with, in this session, the biggest problem, the biggest conundrum. We all recognize, I think, in part by us being here today, that we're dealing with an existential crisis. The question just is how we manage it. Remarkably, in the world, we deal with a strange paradox between those that get it, and I assume by your presence here today that you get it, and a great deal of people in the world who might get something of it, but don't necessarily act in the way that might help us mitigate all of these serious issues. And in case you're thinking, well, that's not me, I recognized myself in one of the earlier slides presented that account for, including myself, a rather large proportion of carbon emissions because I'm in that top 10%, as I think probably most of you are too, and I do fly quite a lot. So, you know, here speaks one hypocrite. Let's see if we can examine more about the consumer behavior. So joining me on stage, as David mentioned, are two people who I think it's fair to say know really rather a lot about how you square the circle between desires, reality, expectations, and changing behavior. And many of you will know António Amorim. I think he's probably one of the only people who can sit on this stage and say that his company is directly responsible for consuming a lot of the carbon that we all emitted by coming here on our aeroplanes. He'll tell you a bit more about that, but the remarkable ability of the Cork oak forests to consume things that we emit is obviously one factor that we're going to be thinking very carefully about. Paul Willgoss is a executive director for Marks & Spencer, a UK retailer, and is, I would say, co-responsible or possibly all responsible for Plan A. Yeah, partly responsible for Plan A, which was a seminal program instituted by the retailer 12 years ago now and just renewed last year. He'll tell you a lot more about it, but in summary, it is a commitment to mitigate both climate change, waste, and general environmental harm that it might be caused by things that it sells or produces. And I think probably the most remarkable statistic, and I think one that we'll be coming back to very soon in this discussion, is, and I believe I'm correct in saying, that actually this Plan A, has saved Marks & Spencer's about £750 million in its lifetime so far. And so you wonder why they've recommitted to it for the next 7 years. I suspect they want to save a bit more money as well along the way, whilst doing lots of good. So, with your indulgence, I'm going to sit with my two colleagues here, and then we're going to have a chat. If you want to participate in that chat, I think we may have time for some questions as we go along. But what might be easier to do is deploy technology that is at our fingertips and issue your questions or comments as tweets to the, I think it's at CCL Porto hashtag, and tell us, you know, what you're thinking as we go along. So if you see me looking at my phone while we're chatting, it's not me being, you know, kind of checking out my latest social media, it will actually be looking for comments from yourselves and hopefully bringing you into what will be an absolutely crucial conversation both today and, well, frankly, for the next many years to come. So please give you a brief hand to welcome my two guests here. Right, this is working. Well, gentlemen, we arrive here sort of professionally naked without our PowerPoints to hide behind. Let me just start with you, Paul. What do you think is your motivation for sort of doing the things that I guess you've done at M&S, and where do you stand on this? Just to sort of give us a sense of who you are and where you've come from.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me today. I think the essence of the business that I joined almost 25 years ago was one where a lot of what we talk about now about sustainability or corporate social responsibility was deeply embedded in a business which is now 135 years old. And that very much what was seen probably as paternalistic with regard to how we looked after our staff and so on, was very much motivated from a sense of enlightened self-interest. So I joined a business which had real purpose, which is probably why I've stayed 25 years. And it's not that you were just encouraged to make the right choices and do the right thing, but it was expected that you would, and that you were a guardian of a business and a brand that would be, in a way that many family businesses and farming is a classic, I think, of you leave the business in a better place than when you came in and when you took on that responsibility. So I suppose what motivates me is it's clear to me that I wanted to work for a business that had real purpose, had strong values, which I could align to and feel very, very comfortable in. And I've been rewarded and encouraged and challenged to push the boundaries and do things that, when we started, if you look at Plan A, we didn't know half the answers to the things that we committed to when we launched it 12 years ago.
Thank you, Paul. António, you'll be more familiar to a lot of people in this room, but there may be a few people who are less familiar with the work that your company has been doing, particularly in the area of the environment. I know this is something you personally believe very strongly in. This is why you're here. Just tell us a bit about what your motivations are.
Well, I think that we feel privileged to work in such a unique industry, which is the cork industry. And whenever we're talking about themes like sustainability, we think we are a paradigm of sustainability. In the previous conference that happened here in Porto in June or July, one of the Nobel Prize winners that made a presentation stated 8 world examples or case studies in which that were a true example of how sustainability could be taken to its top. And Cork was certainly one of them, and our company was a reference within that world. So we really believe that we can bring something positive into this discussion. We really think that if you look at the supply chain of cork, taking 25 years to see the first harvesting cork once every 9 years. A cork tree can last up to 200 years. Each single ton of cork produced retains 73 tons of CO2. So just imagine what that contributes to the sustainability of some of our customers here present. When we saw this morning Miguel Torres presenting the CO2 emissions of glass bottles, those emissions can be absolutely cancelled with the use of cork. So we really think that we can play an increasing role in this debate, helping our customers, helping the final customers to relate more to such an important topic as it was discussed here this morning.
So our challenge then, if we're all aligned on, why we're here and doing the right thing, is actually how we get that done, right? So in our conversations prior to today, we've talked a bit about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to engaging the ultimate consumer in what we do. And we recognize, as I was alluding to earlier, this paradox between knowing that you ought to be doing the right thing, perhaps wanting to do the right thing, but perhaps not being able to, or connecting that desire to actual behavior when you're at the store shelf, when you're in the Marks and Spencer's or other supermarket. Paul, can you just give us a few examples, perhaps from your past, or indeed the Plan A work that you've done, of what's worked and perhaps also what hasn't worked for M&S in this area?
I think one of the things that is recent, and we talked about this last night at dinner, and we talked about it again this morning over breakfast, was the move to what we call more sustainable diets, which is plant-based proteins rather than reliance on animal proteins, animal byproducts. And that's not new. I mean, veganism has been around for a long time, vegetarianism has been around a long time, as has flexitarianism, although we don't necessarily recognise it until more recently. But there's something's happened in a series of moments and trends that have come together, and all of a sudden there is momentum in something that we've all been involved in and supporting for some time. And I think one of the things that works for us is when we understand those tipping points and we can anticipate the tipping points, and that movement into more sustainable diets, and whether that's consumers concerned about their health, whether it's about concern about climate change, or indeed whether it's to do with animal welfare and so on. And it doesn't really matter as long as we anticipate when that tipping point is and when that becomes a real structural change. So I think things like that, and I would say that on vegan and vegetarian, we've been reasonably successful in anticipating that and having a proposition for consumers on that basis. I think one of the more recent ones where we didn't anticipate the change and the tipping point happened very quickly was plastic. And I think we all knew that we needed to get to more recycled content, more recyclability. We needed to create a circular economy when it came to packaging. And we had a plan. And then in the UK specifically, David Attenborough's programme Blue Planet, and one episode on the pollution of the marine environment through plastic and the irresponsible disposal of plastic, suddenly changed the tipping point that we'd anticipated would have been a few years away, suddenly happened, and virtually overnight. And I think we were slow to realise and recognise that and react to it. And some of our competitors were quicker and slicker and so on. And there are things where, so that didn't work for us. In fact, we were criticised for some of the things we did, albeit in 2008, we were the first people to start charging for carrier bags long before any legislation. But we weren't anticipating that tipping point, and we were seen as out of touch. So you've got to be close to all of, close to those trends, I think, in order to anticipate.
So it's interesting you bring up, the sort of influence of media. So I read not long ago that nearly 9 in 10 people who've seen that one episode of Blue Planet 2, just quick hands up, who actually has watched that episode of Blue Planet 2? It's a very interesting effect that it has on people, because about 9 in 10 people who've watched that episode say they have either moderately or, in the case of about half of them, dramatically changed their behaviour towards plastic. And so, you could say, well, that's a temporary thing. Well, it might be, but I've changed, and I'm probably not going to go back to having plastic bottles of water in my life. I've got, one of those reusable cups, and you see them a lot where I go to work. I suppose, António, just turning to you, you've obviously got a great story to tell, and yet, not to put too fine a point on it, the last 20 years have seen a lot more people buying wine not in Cork than before. So where would you say you've been successful, and where would you say you've struggled to kind of make that impression on consumers?
I hope that commitment of yours towards plastic bottles also applies when you open a bottle of wine with plastic corks. Yeah. Don't buy them again.
I already said I was a hypocrite, so
we have been somehow living on the merits of the sustainable Cork story. Just to give you an idea, we did a recent product life cycle study, and our emissions are 6% of what we capture as far as CO2. So you probably can say, and that's mainly to do with transport. You can say, well, these guys have their case study done. No, I think we can do a lot better. And there are two things where I believe we can improve. First of all, is to close the circular economy cycle. We need to probably partner with people like Marks and Spencer's to do a recycling program for their corks. Just to give you an idea, we have a partnership program going on with NH hotels. They give us all the used, opened cork stoppers that they recover in the whole of their hotels, which is about between 2 and 5 tons a year. We can produce that 8,000 square meters of cork flooring a year that we can apply and install in 300 of their rooms because they only use cork flooring in their hotels. So that's the kind of thing that we can do if we can get better at this circular economy point of view. I think this is one of the strong points we need to close this cycle. Over the last 10 years, we have recycled 550 million corks. 10 years. So that gives between 50 and 60 million corks a year, which sounds a lot. If you think that we produce 25 million corks a day, it is nothing. So I think we can get better at this, but we need to get into partnerships with supermarkets. We have a very successful project in Portugal with Continent and with an NGO called Quercus, in which people can put their used corks that we then pay, because they are raw material for us, to this NGO, and this NGO plants trees. We have planted more than 800,000 trees over the course of these last 10 years. So those are the efforts that I believe we can get better at, but we need also to establish partnerships with more people.
Okay, so
wineries, for example, are a good sourcing of recycled corks. How many bottles are opened in wineries for tasting, for comparative analysis? So that's the kind of thing that we can get better at.
So we could do better, and I think we're all saying we ought to do better. I think one of the biggest barriers that I've noticed, and my stock in trade is consumer behavior and data, is the observation that people are willing to make a change in what they do, but really only if it doesn't cost them anything. I think if it's frictionless to them, that's fine. If it involves paying more money, then, well, they'll seek to avoid that. Paul, if I could just turn to you. I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this. There is, that lovely example which you alluded to earlier of when plastic bags suddenly became deeply unfashionable to own, and everyone then started walking around with a reusable one. In part, it was driven by an initiative that your company started, but I think it was mainly to do with the fact that people hated spending money they didn't have to spend. So there's a positive element of it, clearly. One of the negative elements is that a lot of what we've been seeing earlier today is really good agricultural practices, but that often end up adding cost to the product. So ultimately, someone's got to pay for that. Ultimately, that's probably going to be the consumer. And persuading them to pay more for the same thing is pretty tough, isn't it? How do you fix that?
Yeah, I think the idea that you can charge a premium for sustainable products is counterintuitive. I mean, to me, it's just counterintuitive. That makes it non-sustainable because, by definition, you're premiumising something that will then become niche. And because it's niche, therefore, it's probably going to lack scale, and therefore, it's going to lack impact, etc., etc., etc. So it becomes a self-fulfilling negative prophecy, if you like. I think the carrier bag example was an interesting example. We were a year into Plan A, and the Daily Mail had been campaigning about single-use carrier bags. And our chief executive, Stuart Rose, said, "I've got an idea. Why don't we charge for carrier bags?" And we gave away hundreds of millions of single-use carrier bags every year. So the idea was that we were going to charge our customers 5p to buy a single-use carrier bag, but we were going to provide multi-use bags, bag for life. We were going to provide other sources of and so on. Now, for a retailer that is we're a top-up shop. People come to us and they buy a few items. This was quite a high-risk strategy, and if you remember in 2008, the economy, certainly in the UK, was pretty grim. But I think the good news was there was two lessons, really. One was we gave very, very simple communication to our colleagues in store who had to bear the brunt of customers arriving at the till without a carrier bag and saying, "Would you like to buy a carrier bag to take the product that you've just bought from us away?" And that was tough, I think, for those guys. But what it did was, I think we did create a movement, and the Daily Mail put us on the front page congratulating us for that leadership. But we reduced consumption of carrier bags by over 80% overnight. And that is, if you talk about how much money Plan A saved the business, quite a lot of that was actually, we went from giving away carrier bags for free to charging customers for carrier bags and covering our cost. We then gave the profit to charity to do good environmental and social work. So actually, when we got the story together, and I think we changed behaviour, right? And you can go to different parts of the world today, and I think we were talking about this a while ago, where you can see, I was in Greece in the summer, you can see the Brits arriving at the supermarket because they bring their carrier bags with them. And that is it's a really significant behavioural change, which I think is now embedded in UK culture.
So if we can say, be encouraged by that, but with the caveat that behaviour change will often only happen when a lot of things are aligned. So you had a media campaign, people were saving money, perhaps they thought that they ought to be doing better, and now was a great excuse come along. And there was some money saving in it, so there was something in it for the producer and the retailer. António, I mean, you're a student of economics amongst many things. You're a graduate of a fine university in the United Kingdom, as well as several other fine universities from around the world. If you're taking a sort of behavioural economics point of view to this, are we barking up the wrong tree by saying, people just ought to behave better and sort of hitting them with a moral stick?
No, I think that we're not possibly seeing the end to this. First, sustainability is not the enemy of profitability. Secondly, you're talking about business, the wine business that worldwide is growing 0.5% a year, if that. On the other hand, you have, for example, organic wines. I went to Vinexpo to look at some statistics. In 2012, 350 million bottles of organic wines were sold in the world. 2018, 680 million bottles of organic wines were sold in the world, and they project for 2022, 1 billion bottles of organic wine sold in the world. So the whole world is growing at 0.5%, and organic wines are growing at 15% a year. So I think this is a huge business opportunity for retailers, for the wineries themselves. And bear in mind one additional thing. We are witnessing a change of consumer behavior. We're going from Generation X to millennials. Millennials already represent 42% of the wine purchasing in a country like America. Millennials are people that are more health conscious and more climate mindful, environmental mindful. These are people that want to know about wine. These are people that tend to stay in at home and drink wine. When they go out, only 50% of those drink wine. But because most of them stay in, I think this is a huge opportunity. These guys are not not buying the most expensive wines. But the average price for wine is growing in a country like America because of millennials. And I think these are people that are going to be your next target if they are not your today's target. So I really believe that there is an opportunity here, an opportunity that could be good for the wineries themselves, that could create differentiation for retailers. So I do not think we should see this only as a response to whatever is going to happen to the future of the world that was very well presented here this morning. I still think this is a huge opportunity for people to capture, because millennials are their best ally, and they are the present and future consumer. These people are thirst for knowledge. They want to know about wine. They probably cannot afford the most expensive wine from a famous producer, but they will certainly buy the second wine from that producer because they associate that brand with a quality brand. So I think this is really something that we should not look at saying, well, this is going to have a big burden on our P&L account. No, this is going to have a huge positive contribution for our P&L account, with one condition. Organic wines, sustainable farmed wines must be of a better quality than normal. And if we associate quality with sustainability, quality with organic, as I think most of the press is doing, you go to Burgundy, biodynamic wines. You look at Bordeaux, Pontet-Canet went biodynamic. The whole world went crazy, and Pontet-Canet became one of the most important top chateaux in Bordeaux since they have taken the commitment to go biodynamic. So I think there is media support for people to associate sustainability and organic wines with quality. And if that is the case, then you're going to make money out of this commitment of yours.
I'm glad you brought the M word up, because obviously this is an area that I'm very interested in, and I think most of us in the room who are following this generation that's now, frankly, mostly in their 30s, some in their 20s still, and indeed the generation after that, which has various names, but let's just call them the next gens, they have a remarkably different attitude to both life, products that they like to consume, and specifically alcohol. A frightening attitude in some respects, because they're not nearly as into alcohol as they used to be, or people like them used to be 20 or 30 years ago when I was among that cohort. So Paul, he's coming to you on this one anyway, right? A lot of your consumers are millennials. How do you leverage what António is talking about? I mean, first of all, do you agree that they are presenting a very different and possibly hopeful challenge in terms of their consumer behavior?
Yeah, I think the first point I would say is the importance of quality. And I think if we learn from what we didn't do well, and I'm talking as a general food industry, but also we would have examples in our clothing business where we went down the route of organic or fair trade, but the quality of the product wasn't good enough, and the customer walks away from it because that's the be-all and end-all, is the value equation for the customer of quality times price, times innovation, times provenance, and all those things add up to the value perception. So if you don't get the quality right, you don't get the value perception for the customer right, and then they won't have anything to do with it. Fair trade cotton, using a very different example outside of the food industry, we made a commitment to, I think we were going to, 25% of the cotton we were going to use was going to be fair trade by within 5 years or whatever. Absolute disaster. I think there are no longer any warehouses full of fair trade cotton awaiting for us to use it, but there were for many years, because the fibres were shorter, the quality of the cotton was not as good, and the customer said, well, I don't get this. You told me that this was going to be better, and it wasn't. And I think customers are really perceptive, and they are quite fickle. And I think the millennials are even more challenging. So they want to associate themselves with a brand or a business that has real values, has real purpose. But then you have to live up to it in the proposition you put in front of them, in the values that you present to them, and you can't cut corners, because the world is so transparent today that anything that you do is it's a mobile phone away from you know. And Richard, you're obviously checking on the cricket score, but it's those sorts of things which we see continually, and I think it is exciting. Because we are seeing a completely different shift at a pace that we haven't seen consumer behaviour shift before. The other thing I'd say, though, is we've got an awful lot of boomers in our stores every day who actually have quite a lot of disposable income. And somewhere, and we talked about this yesterday, I think, in terms of how entrenched people's behaviours when it comes to sort of wine consumption is and so on. So we have to keep them happy, because that's our core customer base, while being relevant to the millennials and the next generation. And I think that's the trick for all our businesses, is you can't just go after one. You're going to have an adaptive model that can attract all different generations of consumers with their different views.
And recognising that very good point. What I think we're going to be trying to do, the sort of few minutes we've got left, is to try and help all of us here to sort of build, I guess, a basic theory of how consumer behaviour, expectations, and marketing can essentially build a better and more effective response to climate change. One of the biggest problems, as we see in actually making that leap, is what you just referred to, which is essentially the communications piece. And there's been a fantastic amount of very good work done about actually why generally people don't get it, as in they don't get climate change. And the reason for that is the Kahneman theory of fast brain, slow brain, it would appear. So your slow brain, your analytical, progressive brain will understand and kind of contemplate all of that fantastic information that we've seen so far. Your fast brain, which is generally speaking the one making a decision at the store shelf or what type of wine to buy, is not listening. It's not taking any of that into account. And there is this fundamental disconnect, isn't there, at a communications level, where people just aren't recognizing or translating, and I include the millennials in this as well, because, well, my children are slightly younger than millennials, but you should see what they put in the bin and not the recycling, because they're not thinking. They're just putting all the plastic packaging, and I'm the one that takes it out, washes it, put it in, and so on. I'm sure you've all been there, right? So, António, is it too complicated to try and explain stuff to people, like, the stuff that you've been doing with tree planting and the environment? Should we just simplify the message and make it really, almost idiot-proof to get this kind of thought over the line?
I think you need to I think this is something that is food for thought. I mean, the consumer wants to hear this. If he can associate a quality wine with a wine that fulfills all his ticking points that he needs to verify as a knowledgeable consumer, I think you got his loyalty. And I think this is really what we should strive for. And I think that, I mean, I was looking at the Torres website before coming here, and they have a statement that says what I believe should be said elsewhere. The more we care for the earth, the better our wine. So you cannot be hypocritical about it and say, well, I'm having organic wines because this is the flavor of the month. I mean, that's not the issue. This is something sustainable. This is something that is going to be long-term. This is something that's going to be living with us for the whole of our lives. But we cannot be hypocritical about it. We need to be transparent. I cannot have an organic wine under a screw cap, in my point of view. I cannot have an organic wine with a plastic stopper. Makes absolutely no sense. If you have to be coherent and go that way, you need to go that way the whole way. And I think that consumers are only eager to be told that story, to have those arguments to support you. Gerard from Conchetoro, they have a fantastic vineyard in Emiliano, which is supposed to be sustainable and organic. I mean, they have some of the best wines in Chile with the loyal customers. That's the kind of thing that we need to get and present. And I believe that retailers play a major role in this. Because you guys, opinion makers, wine critics, and retailers are the decision makers of this industry. The consumer might think one way. If the supermarket or the retailer of the wine critic tells him otherwise, they probably do not go that same way. So I believe that companies like Marks & Spencer, the UK retailers, the French retailers, if they start pressing on the supply chain that this is the way to go, I think this will happen. And everybody's going to be very happy about it. And you're going to sell at a better price point. Consumer is going to be happy. So I think that this whole thing is about to happen. Wine critics are also, I mean, how many of the top 100 Wine Spectator wines in the world are biodynamic or organic or with sustainable farming? Those kind of statistics, they really need to start showing up because the consumer wants to see his identity related to those type of information. And because he's thirsty for knowledge, I think that he will dig those information up and support his buying options.
So I'll just pick up on one thing there. In the interest of not making this a complete love-in, throw the controversy into the mix. So I'm just picking up on also what Christina said in an earlier presentation, which is, the supply chain ought to be doing more. And she singled out retailers in that. Antonio's just done the same thing. Paul, is it all on you? Is it
Is that the time? How about a bit of lunch? So we have a fundamental role. I agree with that. We are the shop window for many industries and many supply chains, and we collate a range of products to offer to our customers, which have to live up to the values of the business as a retailer. So yeah, we have a fundamental responsibility. I think we need to be careful that we don't take a responsibility to educate and tell customers and preach, because our view is that turns them off very quickly. But we do have a job to inspire. To make it fun, to make it interesting, and to make it really simple for consumers, so that they can play their part and feel good about that. Because you're right, Antonio, you will, if you've got a great product with great provenance at great value, you will get huge loyalty, and that's good for business. So I'm absolutely with Antonio. I think sustainable business is good business. It's not necessarily easy. It's not the easy choices and so on, and therefore we have the challenge as retailers, the shop front for all our supply chains, to make some difficult decisions occasionally and be brave enough to see them through. So yes, I do think we have huge responsibility. It's not always all our fault, but if we've made a decision to give shelf space or channel space through online to a product, then we have taken responsibility to make sure that product has integrity and value. So, yeah, but I think it's something we have to share. And I think one of the things that we've done over the last 12 years or so is we've created what we call the supplier exchange. And there's a series of exchanges where we invite suppliers to just come in, it doesn't cost anything, and we do virtual exchange, and we do exchange live where people come together, and we talk about environmental, social, ethical issues. And we create best practice, and we share case studies and so on, and we're trying to inspire everybody on a journey towards what we call gold. And the good news is that about 2/3 of our supply base are now on the journey from provisional, bronze, silver, gold. We've got some suppliers who are saying we need a platinum standard, and we're saying fine, if you want to go carry on, that's great, but we need to concentrate on the people. Now, the problem that we all have is not the people in the room. The problem is the 30% of our suppliers who have not actually started on the sustainability journey. And that's the bit that's the bit I worry about, is where are we going to buy our products from that we currently buy from those businesses? Because I don't believe they're going to be here in the medium term, because I don't think their model is adapting to the pressures of the industry and the challenge, environmental and social challenges that we face as an industry. So we need to find a way of bringing them on the journey with us, and recognising the business case. Yeah, there's a case study on our website that talks about the business case of Plan A. It's pretty compelling. Why? That's why successive chief execs of Plan A, of Marks and Spencer, have stuck with Plan A, because there's a business case that says this makes good business.
So if we're building our theory, it's got to have there has to be a business case for mitigating climate change in everyone's business. Well, I think that's pretty obvious when you think about it, but it's remarkable actually how often that hasn't happened. Fundamental quality of a product, it's got to actually be better. Yeah, even if it's more sustainable, biodynamic, etc., it's actually just got to do a job better. There's got to be some simplicity in the message so people get it and can act on it. And I think, António, your point is that, and Paul's as well, is that we recognize now that there is a changing consumer dynamic, and the youngsters are at least going to, be up with the change in behavior at the corporate level, perhaps leading it as well, if they are anything like the young lady, Greta Thunberg. I'm sure you've come across her, who's been leading a series of school strikes. She's originally from Sweden, and is causing quite a stir amongst my children's generation, with a really strident approach and a very interesting kind of almost militant kind of attitude. António, we're working with our theory here. Would you add anything else? Would there be other dimensions that you would want to see?
I just think that we cannot expect to do a little bit more. We really need to make this a priority in everything that we do. And once you start certifying your companies with the ISO 14000, when you start to do as we do, because we are a listed company, having to write sustainability reports, when you're starting to be, for example, today, there are investors, financial investors, that send auditors, nothing to do with the accounts or the projections or the analytics on our stock, just to see how sustainable we are as a company. Are you as sustainable as you say that you are? So I think that people relate, they are positive about this. Today there are investment funds that are only invest in sustainable companies as long as they match a certain rating of sustainability. So this is not wishy-washy kind of talk. And I think that the takeaway for these 2 days is that we cannot get out of a meeting like this and say, okay, we're going to do a little bit better than what we were doing before Wednesday. No, what are the objectives that we're going to set for our company? What are the 5-year, 10-year? How can we support our countries? How can we support everything that our countries have been engaging themselves in doing in 20 or 30 years' time? Probably not knowing exactly where they were committing to, but how can we as a company, how can we as individuals really support those efforts long term? And I mean, the fact that we work as a company with a sustainable, natural raw material, the fact that we don't basically have any emissions, that doesn't mean that we cannot get better. We have to get better. We are making sustainability a priority with an already sustainable business. So that's the kind of commitment that I believe that retailers, wineries, viticulturalists, we need to do. So we cannot come out of these 2 days having made the effort to be here for people flying from all over the world and leave as we came. No, I think that we need to get out and we need to commit ourselves to this path.
Yes, we're all going to be leaving by train, I think, now, aren't we? Yeah, you get to walk home. Okay, Paul, so that, I guess, is an interesting challenge to you. You've got 6 years left on the next Plan A commitment. What are you going to do that's, you know, spectacular, that's going to get the job done, as António says?
I think this one's a really interesting one. So if you go back to the original Plan A, there was 100 commitments right the way across the organisation. We renewed it a few years later and we had another 75. But we had closed some off, we had delivered some. And then we decided we'd go again and we added some more. And all of a sudden you realise that you're doing loads and loads and loads of small things. They're not bad things, but actually it's becoming an industry in its own right. And your ability to articulate to 85,000 colleagues what Plan A is there, what we're trying to achieve. And it's really a change programme. So Plan A in consumer world doesn't really resonate, doesn't really exist. It was a change programme for ourselves and our supply chain. Our conclusion is, and we use a mantra in the business, which is bigger, bolder, faster. And we've decided that actually we've got loads and loads of commitments, some of which are regulatory, so we'll do them anyway because we just have to. But we need to concentrate on the things that are going to have real impact. So in a food business, we've decided there are 3 things we're going to do. And it doesn't mean we won't do the other things aren't important, but 3 things we're going to do, and we're going to do them really well. Now, the first reason for it is because it aligns to our business strategy, okay? The second thing is because we believe that it's important to our consumers. So the first one is food waste. It's a moral, social, and economic issue for the whole of society. It's not just an M&S thing, it's not a UK thing, it's a global issue. And we need to address all the causes of food waste and reduce that. We won't ever be waste-free. That I don't think will ever be waste-free. And we thought, when we originally launched Plan A, that we'd done it, because by 2012, we've sent nothing at all to landfill. Whether that from our clothing business, our food business, our construction, nothing went to landfill. And that was fine in 2012, but today it's no longer relevant. You've got to be far better, you've got to be far more sophisticated. So our mantra is that every piece of consumable food should find its way to a human stomach. Quite easy to say, it's quite difficult to do. So the first one's food waste, have real impact, and so on. The second one is sustainable diets. And this is actually taking our customers who they're on that trend, remember what I said earlier, they're on that journey towards more sustainable diet, less animal-based diets. And we need to also, at the same time, we need to tackle where we are using animal products and we're consuming animal protein, that actually is from more and more sustainable sources, and whether that's sustainable fishing or whether that's animal feed or whatever. You have to do both. You can't say, right, we've got a range of vegan food and therefore tick, we're done. You have to deal with the whole landscape. And it's our proxy for climate change. I was really keen that we did something which was around climate change, But actually, from a consumer point of view, I can't connect climate change with the bag of potato crisps, because I don't get carbon and crisps. It doesn't. So you have to make it really simple. So sustainable diet is one, because actually it's on trend and it makes sense for us from business. And then the final thing is plastic. And plastic is, I suppose, in many respects, we know it's forefront of our consumers' minds. We talked about Blue Earth too. And I would say, if you've got 45 minutes at some point over the next, please just go and have a look at it, because it just changed your thinking. Plastics is a proxy for responsible resources. The use of finite resources in a responsible way and actually closing the loop. So it doesn't mean we're only going to do stuff on plastic, but we will do big things on plastic, reducing the amount we use, having more recycled content, and closing the loop. And the reason we're going to do that is A, it's forefront customer mind, B, packaging is expensive, and C, we're going to get taxed really, really heavily over the coming years with EPR. So it makes sense all the way. It's back to the sustainable business model. Why wouldn't you do it? So that's how we're trying to do it.
So if we add to our theory, you've got to go big, bold, and are you saying quick? Maybe also, which you didn't say or alluded to, is actually there's a bunch of stuff that you've got to ignore for now, or at least say we can't do anything about that. Would that be fair?
I think you've got to be realistic about every business has finite resources. Yeah, you've got to be realistic about, if you want to go after us dealing with food waste and packaging, particularly with EPR. That's got tens of millions of pounds worth of commercial benefit to the business before we worry about anything else. So you have to go after things that are going to make a big difference and where you can have big impact. That means, it doesn't mean that all the other commitments that we've made, all the other public commitments, doesn't mean we're not going to do it. But we might extend the timeline. We might put them into the next phase. Because otherwise what you do is you do loads and loads of things, but you only do a little bit. It's the incrementality, whereas we need to be transformational now. We've heard that from the speakers this morning.
So we're about to transform ourselves into lunch, but before we do that, are there any questions that the floor would like to put to my two brave guests here, or any comments to add to our working theory?
Thank you, and excellent presentation by all of you. I was intrigued about Cork and the connection to retail and recycling. Have you come up with an idea, perhaps, for a Cork credit, where the consumer benefits by recycling directly at the retail point and receiving discount for their goods?
I think if I understand you correctly, the question is about I guess, how you use cork as a transformative property in wine, but maybe in other areas too, and how you actually deliver on that. I suppose, you're, after all, the biggest cork producer in the world, aren't you? Yeah? And you have a responsibility to make sure we're all drinking wine with corks in it. How are you going to deliver on that?
Okay, I think that, some of the things that Paul said are absolutely fundamental to defend the case for Cork. We have zero waste, and we have something in common. We both hate plastics. So that's not a bad starting point. On top of all this, putting it to figures. Miguel Torres showed here this morning that a glass bottle can release about 300 to 400 grams of CO2 for some of the types of bottles that he mentioned. A single cork can absorb 392 grams of CO2. So basically, we can make a partnership with our glass friends, and we can cancel the negative effects that glass bottles may have in the whole supply chain. So I believe that we can become more relevant within packaging. We can become a lot more relevant as far as organic, sustainable farmed wines and biodynamic wines. And I think that if that partnership goes all the way, I think that we can grow our market share. What do we need to do? We need to plant more cork trees, because that's the limitation we have, and that's something that we are starting to do in the most sustainable way possible. So that's the challenge that we have ahead of us. Make sure that we are going to have enough cork to supply a potential growing demand if everything that is being said over this morning, and I'm sure throughout this afternoon and tomorrow, is going to happen.
So thank you, António. So we'll add to our theory, plant more trees, Cork and otherwise, right? I just wanted to finish, we've got about 1 minute to go, the incomparable President Obama, who came to speak here last year, and this is the measure of the man, went yesterday to the heart of the oil industry in Canada, in Alberta, and he made a speech to them about climate change. Now you can imagine that's not something the Donald's going to do ever, is it? At least not what he said to them. And he said to them the following: all of us are going to have to recognize, and I can't do his voice, so apologies, all of us are going to have to recognize that there are trade-offs involved in how we live. Nobody is exempt from this conversation. So will you please join me in thanking our two panelists here, António Amorim and Paul Willgoss, for an excellent conversation.